At 2 in the morning on the coldest Tuesday in January, Rory Dunfield noticed a silver sedan parked in the shadow between two loading bays behind the Westbrook Commercial Tower. Engine off, windows fogged with the breath of someone who had been sitting inside too long. He had worked the overnight maintenance shift at Westbrook for 6 years. He knew which security lights flickered, which delivery drivers left their rigs running to stay warm, and which vehicles belonged to the stragglers who worked past midnight on the upper floors. The silver sedan belonged to none of those categories. It was too expensive for a delivery driver and too still for someone waiting. Rory had every reason to keep walking. He was 41, carrying a thermos and a work order for a failed HVAC unit on the 14th floor. His daughter Iris was asleep 3 blocks away at his neighbor Greta's apartment, and he needed to finish his rounds before 6 so he could be home when Iris woke up. He had learned in the years since his wife Nicole had died to protect the hours that belonged to his daughter. Everything else could wait. He crossed the icy pavement anyway. The woman inside was not asleep. She was sitting very upright against the driver's door, her head resting against the fogged glass, her eyes open and fixed on something that was not in the car. She was wearing a charcoal blazer over a cream blouse, and her dark hair had come loose from what had probably been, at some earlier point in the day, a careful arrangement. On the passenger seat, a laptop bag, a leather portfolio, and a cardboard box holding a framed photograph and a stack of manila folders. Rory tapped the window twice with his knuckle. She turned immediately. For a split second, terror moved across her face before something harder replaced it. He raised his hands, palms out. "Sorry to startle you," he said through the glass. "I work in the building. You've been parked here a while. It's -22. She lowered the window 2 inches. Cold air rushed in from both sides. "I'm aware of the temperature." "Your engine's off." "Also aware." Rory glanced at the exhaust pipe, confirming what he already knew. "No heat. How long have you been sitting here?" She didn't answer. He looked at her hands where they rested on the steering wheel. Her knuckles were pale. "There's a maintenance office just inside the loading bay. It's not much, but it's warm, and there's a coffee maker. You can sit until morning if you need to." She studied him the way people studied offers they had stopped trusting. His jacket had a Westbrook maintenance patch stitched above the pocket. His expression held concern and nothing else. That seemed to be what made her decide. She said her name was Beatrice, nothing more. Rory did not recognize the name Beatrice Morrow. He did not follow business news. He had enough difficulty following his own accounts, which currently held $230 until the 15th of the month. He knew Morrow Biomedical existed the way most people in Calgary knew it existed, as the glass and steel building on 8th Avenue with the green M above the entrance, but he had never connected a face to it. Inside the maintenance office, he poured 2 cups from the coffee maker the day crew left running out of habit and set one in front of her without asking how she took it. She wrapped both hands around the cup. Her fingers were stiff with cold, and she flexed them slowly against the warmth. He worked while she sat. He updated his log, checked the overnight temperature alarms on his tablet, and ate half a granola bar without offering to share, because he had already given her the only coffee cup he had. She watched him with the particular attention of someone who had spent years in rooms where people performed purpose without meaning it. He performed nothing. He simply worked. At 4:15, his phone buzzed, a text from Greta. Iris had woken from a nightmare and was asking for him. He typed back that he'd be home by 6, then set the phone down. Beatrice looked at the screen before the message disappeared. "Your daughter." "She's 9, has bad dreams sometimes." He paused. "She'll be fine." Beatrice looked toward the window that faced the parking bay. "How long since her mother died?" The question was direct in a way most people avoided. Rory found he didn't mind it. 3 years. She nodded once, the small acknowledgement of someone who understood that number in a way she hadn't expected to. He did not ask her anything in return. He finished his work order and told her she could stay in the office until his shift ended at 6. After that, he offered her the only alternative he had, the spare room in his building's basement, a proper room with a cot that his neighbor Greta kept for her adult son when he visited from Edmonton. She almost refused. He could see the calculation behind her eyes. Liability, appearances, the instinct of someone accustomed to controlling the terms of every arrangement. Then she looked at the frost collecting along the bottom of the window and agreed. Greta Okonkwo was 68 years old and had raised 3 children in 3 different countries before settling in Calgary with her late husband, a petroleum engineer named Samuel who had died the previous spring. She took one look at Beatrice standing in her hallway at 5:45 in the morning, and immediately put on a second pot of tea. "You'll have the cot in the storage room," she told Beatrice, in the tone of someone who had already decided and was simply informing the other party. "There are clean blankets in the hall closet. You look like someone who hasn't eaten properly in 2 days." Beatrice opened her mouth. "3 days," Greta corrected, studying her face. "Sit down." Iris appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, hair flat on one side, carrying a book she had clearly not been reading. She had her father's quiet way of assessing people before speaking. "Why are you here?" she asked Beatrice. "Iris," Rory said. "It's a fair question," Beatrice said. She looked at the girl. "I didn't have anywhere else to go." Iris considered this. "We didn't either when Mum died. We stayed with Greta for 2 months. She glanced at Greta. "She snores." "I do not snore," Greta said, setting a plate of toast in front of Beatrice. That evening, while Rory was putting Iris to bed, Beatrice sat at the kitchen table and stared at the framed photograph she had taken from the cardboard box. A woman in her early 60s stood at a podium at what appeared to be a university convocation, smiling with the particular pride of someone who had never expected to be standing there. Behind her, a banner read Morrow Biomedical Sciences. Inaugural funding announcement. Saskatoon, 2001. Greta, washing dishes, said without turning around, "Your mother?" "She built the company with a personal loan and 20 years of research notes." Beatrice set the photograph flat on the table. "She died 18 months ago. I became CEO 8 years ago. And now someone is trying to take it." Beatrice looked at the back of Greta's head. "Yes." Greta set down the dish towel and sat across from her. "Tell me from the beginning." Doreen Morrow had built Morrow Biomedical around a single conviction: that children with treatment-resistant epilepsy deserved a better option than the medications that left them foggy and slow and unable to sit through a school day. She had spent 2 decades developing a molecular compound that reduced seizure frequency without the cognitive side effects of existing drugs. The early results had been extraordinary. By the time Doreen died, the compound, coded M7 internally, was in phase 3 clinical trials. It was the company's most valuable asset and its most personal one. Beatrice had co-founded the company's corporate structure with Alastair Penn, whom she had married 7 years earlier. Alastair was everything Doreen had never been: polished, comfortable in boardrooms, skilled at reading investors. Beatrice had believed that balance was the company's strength. It took her 6 years to understand it was a vulnerability. Alastair had been redirecting a percentage of trial funding through a consulting arrangement with a firm controlled by 2 board members. The arrangement had begun small, then grown. When Beatrice discovered the irregularities in the trial budget, she confronted him privately. He told her she was misreading the accounting. She hired an independent financial analyst. 2 weeks later, the board convened an emergency meeting at which Alastair presented documentation alleging that Beatrice had approved alterations to M7's Phase 3 data to strengthen the regulatory submission to Health Canada. The documentation was false, but it had been prepared carefully. Beatrice was placed on administrative leave. Her access to company systems was suspended. Alastair petitioned for a court order freezing jointly held accounts while the fraud allegations were under review. She found herself, within 10 days, unable to access funds, unable to enter her building, and unable to reach the clinical trial records that would disprove everything he had said. She had tried 3 hotels. One required a credit card she could no longer use. Another had a lobby camera that a journalist photographed by the following morning. A friend from graduate school offered her guest room, then sent a careful text message retracting the offer after someone from Morrow's board had apparently been in touch. That was how she came to be sitting in a parking bay on the coldest night of January, in a car she owned outright because she had bought it before the marriage, with no plan that extended beyond mourning. Rory heard none of this that night. Beatrice offered him only her first name and the fact of her situation. He sensed her silence was protecting something more complicated than embarrassment, and he did not push. He was watching the late news 2 days later when her face appeared on the screen. He turned up the volume slowly. The segment described ongoing volatility at Morrow Biomedical following the departure of its CEO. A financial reporter stood outside the building on 8th Avenue and used words like instability, mismanagement, and concern. A spokesperson for Alastair Penn said the company's leadership had taken difficult but necessary action to protect the integrity of its clinical programs. A corporate governance expert called it a cautionary tale about family-run enterprises. Iris looked up from her homework. "That's the lady from Greta's." Rory set down the remote. Beatrice had gone very still in the chair by the window. She was watching the segment with the expression of someone reading the terms of their own sentencing. "You should have told me," Rory said, when Iris had gone to the kitchen for a glass of water. "I told you my name. I didn't know what it meant. Would you have helped me if you had?" He thought about it honestly. "Yes, but I would have understood why there's been a black Suburban parked across the street since yesterday morning." Beatrice stood and moved to the window. The SUV was there, engine running. "They work for Alistair," she said, "or for the board. At this point, the distinction is cosmetic." Rory's jaw tightened. He had not consented to this on behalf of his daughter. He said so quietly. Beatrice nodded. She began gathering her things from the storage room without being asked. She had the leather portfolio in her arms when Rory appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame. "Moving you from place to place is exactly what they want." He exhaled through his nose. "The Suburban stays where it is. You stay here. No more surprises." She looked at him. "No more surprises," he repeated. 3 days later, a business website published a photograph of Rory's building beneath the headline, "Morrow CEO sheltering with unidentified Calgary man." The article implied the relationship was personal. A follow-up piece quoted a source close to Alistair Penn, expressing concern for Beatrice's well-being. Rory's building supervisor called him at 7 in the morning. The conversation was brief and uncomfortable. Rory's overnight position was suspended pending a review of what the supervisor called unprofessional conduct involving the unauthorized use of company premises. He sat at the kitchen table after the call with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes somewhere past the window. He had $114 until the next paycheck. Rent was due in 8 days. Beatrice sat across from him. "I'll cover your wages." "With what? Your accounts are frozen." "I have resources in transition." "You lost your job because of me." He stopped. "No, I lost my job because my supervisor is afraid of a headline. That is not yours to carry." She looked at Iris's school drawings taped to the refrigerator. "People always want something in return," she said. Rory's voice was even. "Then you have been around the wrong people." The pressure continued. Anonymous comments appeared beneath news articles describing Beatrice as erratic, difficult, a woman who had coasted on her mother's legacy. A columnist called her the ousted queen of a mom-and-pop biotech and noted with evident satisfaction that she was now sleeping in borrowed rooms in the North End. One evening, Rory found Iris looking at a forum thread where someone had posted his address. That night, someone broke the windshield of his truck. They left a folded note under the wiper, printed letters, "Go back to your mop." Rory called the police. 2 officers came, took photographs, filed a report. One recognized Beatrice from the news and asked, in a tone that was almost a suggestion, whether she had considered that her presence might be creating a hazard for the other residents. Greta appeared in the hallway behind them with her arms crossed. She said that if either of them had another irresponsible question, she would be happy to discuss it with the building's tenant advocacy committee and the CBC simultaneously. The officers left. Rory stood in the parking lot afterward, looking at the shattered windshield. He did not let himself think about the cost. Not yet. Alistair called Beatrice that evening. She answered on speaker. His voice was composed, even warm. "This has gone far enough," he said. "The people around you are being hurt. Your friend's property was damaged. His daughter is frightened." "She's not frightened," Beatrice said. "She's angry. Sign the separation and release the shares to the trust. I'll have your personal accounts unfrozen within 24 hours. The fraud allegations become a matter of historical record, nothing more." "Nothing more," she repeated. "You get your life back." Beatrice looked at the table. On it was a folder Rory had helped her organize over 3 evenings, printed records, public filings, a correspondence chain she had maintained on a personal email account rather than the company server, because she had begun to suspect months before the board meeting that her suspicions were correct. "What M7 is worth to the investors," she said, "is 1/4 of what it is worth to the children who need it." A pause. "7 is the company's property." "M7 is my mother's 30 years, you added the paperwork." Alistair's voice cooled by a fraction. "The Health Canada presentation is in 2 weeks. The board will submit the revised trial summary. When the regulatory panel sees the independent audit, your version of events will be very difficult to defend." "Then I suppose I should attend." "You're not on the submission team." "No," Beatrice agreed, "but I own the data." She ended the call. Rory set a mug of tea beside her without comment. After a moment, he asked, "Do you actually own the data?" She opened the folder. My mother wrote the original M7 research protocols before Alistair and I restructured the company. The methodology and the archived trial records are in her name in the Founders Registry. Alistair's counsel never moved to transfer them because they didn't think I'd know to use them. Rory looked at the documents. What are they planning to submit to Health Canada? A trial summary that removes 2 cohorts of pediatric participants and adjusts the adverse event reporting to make the phase. 3 results look stronger than they are. She turned a page. The real data shows the drug is both safe and effective. Alistair's version makes it appear dramatically more effective, which sounds positive until the drug reaches approval and the real outcomes don't match the claims. At that point, the liability goes to the company, she paused, and to the children who were dosed on false expectations. Rory was quiet for a moment. He pulled the trial summary toward him. Iris had 3 focal seizures in the 2 years after Nicole died, he said. The neurologist mentioned M7 in the context of kids who don't respond to first-line medication. I didn't know how to say that before now. Beatrice looked at him. Something shifted in her expression that she did not try to hide. That's why I need to go to the hearing, she said. There were 3 attempts to stop her from attending. Alistair's legal team sent a letter asserting that her presence would constitute unauthorized interference in a regulatory process. The board issued a formal statement barring her from representing Morrow Biomedical in any official capacity. A federal court application was filed the morning of the hearing requesting an emergency injunction against her use of the Founders Registry materials. The application was not decided before 10 o'clock. Rory drove her to the federal building in his truck, which he had covered with a canvas tarp to conceal the broken windshield. He had borrowed $40 from Greta to replace the wiper blade. It snowed lightly. The radio played a country station Iris had selected the previous morning, and neither of them changed it. Greta had lent Beatrice a navy blazer that fit across the shoulders and nowhere else. Beatrice had not mentioned it. She walked into the building with the composure of someone who no longer required precise tailoring to explain who she was. The Health Canada regulatory hearing occupied a conference room on the 3rd floor. Representatives from Morrow Biomedical, invited medical experts, patient advocates, and a panel of 5 regulatory assessors sat around a long table. Alistair Penn was at the front, flanked by 2 counsel and a presentation consultant. He saw Beatrice when she entered. For one instant, something moved across his face that was not quite surprise and not quite calculation. Then his counsel approached her. "You have no standing here," the lawyer said quietly. "I have the Founders Methodology Registry." She held up the certified document package, and 23 years of my mother's work. The panel chair, a woman named Dr. Miriam Foucault, looked up from her papers. She asked Beatrice to identify herself. "Beatrice Morrow," she said, "daughter of Doreen Morrow, co-founder of Morrow Biomedical and the registered custodian of the original M7 research archive." The room changed in the way rooms do when the person everyone has been discussing walks in. Alistair's counsel intervened immediately. They described her as a suspended executive acting outside her authority in an attempt to disrupt the regulatory process. They produced the board's formal statement. They referenced the pending court application. Dr. Foucault listened. Then she asked Beatrice whether she disputed the trial summary the board had submitted. "Yes," Beatrice said, in specific and documentable terms. Dr. Foucault looked at the board's counsel, then back at Beatrice. "Then I think we should hear them." Alistair said her name. His voice had the particular cadence of a man accustomed to having the word function as a warning. Beatrice did not look at him. She connected her laptop to the panel's presentation system and opened the first slide. She began with the 2 pediatric cohorts that had been removed from the board's submission. She explained why they had been removed. Their seizure reduction outcomes were strong, but 3 children in the group had experienced temporary increases in appetite and sleep disruption during the first month of dosing. Common, documented, and clinically insignificant. Alistair's revised summary had eliminated the cohort entirely rather than include any notation of side effects, however mild. She moved to the adverse event reporting. The board's submission used a different incident classification system than the one in the original trial protocols. A reclassification that, applied retroactively, changed the safety profile of the drug from one that was thoroughly documented to one that appeared pristine. One of the panel assessors leaned forward. "You're describing a systematic alteration of the reporting methodology." "Yes." "After the trials were completed?" "Yes. The original methodology is registered under my mother's name. It cannot be amended without her signature, or following her death, the signature of the named custodian." She paused. "Which is me?" Another assessor. Ms. Morrow, where did you obtain these records if your access to company systems was suspended? I maintained an offline archive on a personal server. I began doing so 14 months ago when I noticed discrepancies in the trial budget that suggested someone was accessing the data without my authorization. She opened the folder Rory had helped her organize. I printed and certified these records before the board meeting. Alistair's counsel stood. Those documents were removed from company property. They were copied from a personal archive that predates the company's claim to any version of this data. Dr. Foucault asked for a recess. It lasted 40 minutes. Alistair moved through the hallway, speaking quietly to board members. A junior staffer from his team approached Beatrice and offered, in low tones, a revised settlement that would include reinstated access to her accounts if she withdrew the archive materials. She handed the offer back unread. When the panel reconvened, Dr. Foucault asked Alistair directly whether he disputed the authenticity of Beatrice's archive. He looked at her for a long moment, then at his counsel, then at the panel. The records she has presented, he said carefully, reflect an earlier iteration of the trial data. Earlier than the submission your board provided. The methodology evolved. The original registered methodology? A pause. Clinical trial protocols are living documents. Dr. Foucault made a note. Not when they are registered under a deceased founder's credentials. Mr. Penn, the document your team submitted uses a classification system that does not appear in any version of the original trial protocols. Can you explain the provenance of that system? He could not. The panel suspended the review of the board's submission pending an independent audit of both datasets. Health Canada's Compliance Division was informed of the potential irregularities before the hearing formally closed. Alistair and his counsel were asked to remain available for follow-up questions. Rory was in the hallway when Beatrice came out. He had been sitting on a wooden bench with his coat across his lap, reading a water-damaged paperback he'd found in the truck's door pocket, looking up every 15 minutes. He stood when he saw her face. She did not look triumphant. She looked like someone who had just set down something very heavy and was not yet sure whether her hands still worked. It's done, she said. What happens now? The audit, regulatory review, legal. She looked at the window at the end of the hallway where snow was falling steadily on the street below. It will take time. He didn't press her on it. Outside, patient advocates who had been waiting on the steps recognized her. A woman holding a sign that read "Real Data for Real Kids" reached out and took Beatrice's hand with both of hers and didn't say anything at all. Beatrice looked at the sign and nodded once, carefully, as though storing the moment for later. The audit took 11 weeks. The independent reviewers confirmed that the board's submission contained systematically altered reporting data. Alistair Penn resigned from Morrow Biomedical before the findings were released. 2 board members resigned simultaneously. Criminal proceedings were a separate and slower matter, but they began. Beatrice's accounts were unfrozen. The fraud allegations against her were withdrawn. Health Canada's review of M7 was restarted using the original authenticated trial data. She returned tomorrow as interim CEO for the period required to stabilize the company. She restructured the board to require an independent scientific director with no financial stake in the company's products. She established an archive protocol that required all trial methodology to be registered with a third-party scientific registry before the start of any human study. She hired a young research coordinator named Amara, who had spent 2 years trying to flag the data irregularities internally and had been reassigned to a filing role after her 3rd attempt. "Why are you leaving?" Beatrice asked, when Amara submitted her resignation out of shame. "I should have done more. You tried 3 times. The people with the authority to act chose not to use it." Beatrice held her gaze. "Stay, and learn the difference between an instruction that is lawful and one that is worthy." Amara later joined the company's scientific integrity team. Then Beatrice stepped back from the CEO role. There was a board meeting. Investors expressed concern. Senior staff who had supported her return were troubled. Beatrice explained that the company did not need another version of the leadership it had just removed. A single person whose departure would again create a crisis. She would chair the Scientific Advisory Trust. Daily leadership would go to a team with clear, accountable structure. Her mother's original research notes were digitized and placed in a public archive associated with the University of Calgary's neuroscience faculty, accessible to any researcher working on pediatric epilepsy. Doreen Morrow's name went on the archive. Beatrice's name did not. When advisors argued that public recognition would restore her reputation, she was unmoved. A reputation built on displaying every decent act, she told them, is only another form of advertising. In March, Iris participated in the school science fair with a model of a synaptic relay she had built from craft wire and colored beads after spending 3 evenings asking Beatrice questions about how the brain sent signals between cells. She won second place. Beatrice attended and stood at the back of the gymnasium, which Iris had specifically requested. "You came," Iris said when she found her after the awards. "You asked." Iris held up the red ribbon. "Dad said you helped. You did the work. He said you always say that." Beatrice looked across the gymnasium at Rory, who was talking to Iris's teacher and pretending he hadn't noticed Beatrice being assessed. "It's true," she said. The M7 approval came 6 months later. The panel noted the exceptional quality of the long-term pediatric data and the completeness of the adverse event documentation. The drug was approved for children aged 4 and above with treatment-resistant focal epilepsy. The approval summary listed Rory Morrow as the originating researcher. The day the letter came, Beatrice drove to the cemetery in the northeast of the city where her mother was buried. She sat beside the headstone for a long time in the early October sun, which was warm in Calgary in a way that always felt borrowed, like it knew winter was coming. She read the letter aloud, from beginning to end, without skipping the regulatory language. She thought her mother would have wanted the exact wording. Rory found her at Greta's kitchen table that evening. He had brought groceries, and Iris had talked him into buying a lemon cake that neither of them needed. Greta was explaining to Iris with great authority that lemon cake required a particular kind of fork. Beatrice was holding the letter with both hands. "Good news?" Rory asked. She set it on the table and turned it so he could read the header. He read it, then he read it again. He set down the bag of groceries, pulled out the chair across from her, and sat. "Mum," Iris called from the other room, meaning Greta, which had become a habit at some point that no one had particularly noted. "What kind of fork?" Greta said any fork would do, but that she personally preferred a dessert fork with 3 tines, and Iris said she'd never heard of a dessert fork, and Greta said that was a gap in her education they would address immediately. Rory looked at Beatrice across the table, with the approval letter between them and the kitchen making its ordinary sounds around them. "She would have been proud," he said. "Yes," Beatrice folded the letter along its original crease. "I think she also would have found all of this extremely stressful and would have told me I should have seen it coming." Rory almost smiled. Good advice is usually both things at once. Outside, the first snow of October was settling on the city in the way that Calgary snow did, quiet and absolute, committing fully. Beatrice looked at it through the kitchen window. She thought about the parking bay behind Westbrook and the minutes between deciding to lower the window and actually doing it. She thought about how much smaller the world had looked from inside that car, with the engine off and the cold coming in through the glass. She thought about Alistair. Then she realized she had stopped thinking about Alistair sometime in March, and she had not marked the exact day. It had simply stopped. Iris came around the corner carrying 2 plates of cake and a very serious expression. She handed one to Beatrice, one to Rory, and announced she was going back for the third. "Greta says you're staying for dinner," Iris told Beatrice. "Greta didn't ask me." "Greta doesn't ask. She tells you, and then it happens anyway." Iris disappeared back around the corner. Rory looked at the plate of cake in front of him, then at Beatrice. He said in the tone of someone who had thought about this for some time and had simply waited for the right moment, "I'm glad you opened the window." Beatrice was quiet. She looked at the snow on the glass and the light from the street and the kitchen around her, which was not large and not quiet, and was precisely what it was. "So am I," she said. In the spring, construction began on the new pediatric neurology wing at Alberta Children's Hospital. The lead funder was the Rory Morrow Research Foundation. Established with proceeds from a licensing arrangement Beatrice had negotiated with 3 European pharmaceutical partners. The wing would house a clinical trial center specifically designed for long-term pediatric studies, with child-sized waiting rooms and a parent lounge that Greta had insisted on reviewing the plans for, uninvited, and which was subsequently made 12% larger. Beatrice stood at the groundbreaking with a hard hat that did not fit properly and a speech she had rewritten 4 times before deciding the third version had been best all along. She spoke about her mother. She spoke about the 2 cohorts Alistair had tried to erase from the record. Not as a grievance, but as a reminder that the children in those cohorts were the reason every number in every trial had to be a real number. Iris stood in the front row wearing a visitor's hard hat that also did not fit, holding Rory's hand with one hand and Greta's with the other. At the back of the crowd, Rory watched Beatrice at the microphone and thought about the parking bay on the coldest night of January and the 2 inches of window she had lowered before she decided to trust him. He thought about what it had cost her to open the door when every previous door had been closed against her. He thought about Iris's small brain and the number it had appeared as in a trial summary, and the woman who had made certain that number survived to be counted correctly. Strength, he had come to understand, was not always visible from the outside. Sometimes it looked like a woman sitting in a freezing car because she refused to disappear quietly. Sometimes it looked like a man who knocked on the window when everything in him said to keep walking. The ceremony ended. Beatrice signed 2 documents, shook 9 hands, and slipped away from the group before the formal reception. She walked to where Rory and Iris and Greta were waiting at the edge of the lot, in the particular Calgary spring light that was not quite warm and not quite cold and smelled of wet earth and something beginning. Iris handed her back the visitor badge. "Yours says distinguished guest." "Yours says future engineer," Beatrice said. Greta wrote that in marker. Iris inspected the badge, also it's crooked. "Most important things are," Beatrice said, "until someone takes the time to fix them." Rory held out his truck keys. She gave him a look. "I got a new windshield," he said. "Try not to overthink it." She took the keys. They drove home through the quiet streets, his old Silverado following her silver sedan. Neither vehicle looked as though it belonged with the other. That had stopped mattering some time ago, somewhere between a maintenance office and a borrowed cot and a child who asked the right questions before anyone else thought to ask them. The city moved past the windows, familiar and unhurried, and Beatrice kept both hands on the wheel and did not look back.